So the first paper we have in this session is Animals and Society Through the Lens of the Holy Trinity. That's by Guenther, Rebecca Schauer, and Madeleine Palmer. Guenther is an environmental sociologist and an animal studies scholar, teacher, and activist. She studies human coexistence with wild animals. Her work focuses on large carnivores, specifically jaguars, pumas, sharks, and lions. And she's published on human relations, interactions, and encounters on a global scale, as well as in the United States, Paris, Costa Rica, and Africa. And Madeleine Palmer is an undergraduate research fellow supervised by Guenther at Boston College's Sociology department. Entering her junior year, Madeleine's pursuing a Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Studies and a minor in Economics. So you can share your screen whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Paula, and we are just delighted to be here. Maddie's going to share her screen, and I'll just begin because I know we're on a time restriction, and I want to honor that. My name is Jennifer Schauer, and Madeleine is here with me to present this work. You'll see here these beautiful, what we call in this Western world animals or non-human animals or other species. And you'll see elements of air and land and water and just the rich life within other species and what I often call our kin in my work. And so Maddie, I'll ask you to move on to the next slide, please. So we're going to talk about the Holy Trinity a bit here. In sociology, we like to present this very godly aura around Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. And they are often in the literature called the Holy Trinity. They are the founding fathers of sociology, as many of us know. The thing is that animal studies and society and animals has had a very challenging move in sociology. And a lot of it is due to very limited and restricted belief systems and knowledge systems around our forefathers. So this work is to interrogate that a bit, and not in a way to demean it, but to say, can we expand as scholars for the emancipation of our non-human kin? So here we'll see the Holy Trinity as a triangle. And I'll get back to this in a bit because we're also going to look at the Egyptian reign and that triangular notion, as well as the Judeo-Christianity philosophies and religion, and that triangular, very religious and spiritual orientation. So what we call in our work 3 different social realities. So as sociologists, we're constantly constructing reality. And I'm saying that our reality as academic sociologists is based on these masculine qualities that are Western, European-centric, and modern. And they limit our understandings of the world that has not been privileged, a very large population of the world that interacts with animals that cannot write. And so I want to look a bit about gender here, about privilege and income and class, and about femininity, because you see here there are 3 men and no women present. So we're going to move into this a bit, Maddie and I, as we present our work. I'll have you turn this slide, Maddie, please. So I'm going to just talk a little bit in the next 3 slides about how Marx, Weber, and Durkheim have written about animals. And I'll read these quotes and just chat a little bit about some understandings. The first quote is Karl Marx, and it says, quote, "Men can be distinguished from animals by consciousness, by religion, or anything else you like. they themselves begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence, a step which is conditioned by their physical organization, unquote. So again, sociology, and this began with René Descartes, a French philosopher from the 17th century, who wanted to start defining humans in a very hierarchical and turned into a very modified patriarchal way. And so one way to categorize, which we all do in sociology, is to say this is what we are and this is what they're not. So here we see this idea of consciousness and religion often, and Marx and Durkheim both say this, consciousness and language. But if we move above consciousness of humans and language and religion, what we're left with is spirituality and the soul. And it's up here. And we get into this a bit later with the Egyptian reign, that the Egyptians didn't see animals. They didn't define animals until the influence of Christianity. So what do we see? We see that other social realities, other societies that have reigned for centuries did not distinguish animals as different. They saw spirituality and soul bondage, and that interwove with their reality and their society. Thank you, Maddie. I'll have you go on to Durkheim. Oh, it's Weber next. Okay. So Marx's work was a lot about capitalism, and we needed to move into human society to understand that. And Weber's work was a lot about bureaucracies and our bureaucratic institutions. But he also did work on Puritanism and that religious life. And here that this quote, we'll talk a bit about that. Quote, without the inner light, the natural man, even the man guided by natural reason, remained purely a creature of the flesh, unquote. So once again, even though Weber, the least out of Durkheim and Marx, talked about animals, we see him say the inner light, the soul, the spiritual connection, that is man, and animals are mere flesh. They're mere physical material presence on this earth. And if we as humans can move above the flesh, we are godly. We connect with God. We sit here on the hierarchy. This hierarchy we're all familiar with from Judeo-Christianity, where God, Jesus, God, the angels, Jesus, all up here, and then humans, and below humans are animals, other creatures, and plants and other life forms. And I'm saying that's one, we are saying in this work, Maddie and I are saying, this is one reality. This is only one reality. Okay, thank you, Maddie. Please go to the next. So this last slide from the Holy Trinity of Sociology is Émile Durkheim. And Durkheim's work, of course, was vast, like Marx and Weber. But one of his main contributions was separating social facts from biological facts. So again, how can we separate humans from the natural order, the natural world? And so this quote kind of brings that together. Quote, all the organism needs is that the supplies of substance and energy constantly employed in the vital process should be periodically renewed by equivalent quantities. That replacement be equivalent to use. When the void created by existence in its own resources is filled, the animal satisfied asks nothing further, unquote. So this can be read in multitude of ways, as they all can, different interpretations. But sociology's interpretation has been the animal is automatic, kind of that Descartesian, Cartesian philosophy since the 17th century. We move into modernity and they don't. They stay here in earthly nature, wilderness, as flesh, as these instinctual beings that take in substance, air, water, and then they excrete and they do it all over again. there's no thought and no emotion and no soul and no sentient connection to each other and humans. And so this is the pejorative read. And we're saying, let's take a step back as sociologists and ask if we can expand these understandings to include more, Maddie, I'll have you go to the next slide, please. So in our work, we have one reality, one social construction. We've all been living that in this Western institutional frame of Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. And we've all had to read their work. Most of us had to teach about them in social theory and beyond. And in the paper, we look at that work, and then we go into scholars who have done alternative and oppositional readings to try to bring animal studies and society and animals to fruition. And those scholars have done such valuable work. Ryan Gunderson, John Bellamy Foster, Leslie Irvine, Arnold Arluk, the list goes on, who have read these classics and said, look, this is the contribution, and they make a contribution. Yes, they do. But for 20 years, I've seen them try to pull on Marx, Weber, and Durkheim for the emancipation of animals, and it has not worked. So we are saying, let's look into different societies, different wisdoms, different knowledge systems. And those are indigenous cosmologies, which we do not get to in this paper, which are small groups of subgroups of people throughout the globe. But instead, we're saying, let's look at the empires. Let's look at the triangles, the sacred geometry of Egypt here. And we have a goddess and her hybridity and becoming of the animal, of the phoenix. There's emergence, as Deleuze and Guattari would say, of oneness, of unity in creation. She creates, the falcon creates, the phoenix creates. And she sees that, and that is what unites them. In Judeo-Christianity, we have Divine Mother Mary, the Blessed Virgin, a goddess, a sacred feminine of the non-human world. So we're saying, let's look into these other triangular, holy spaces, constructions, realities, and see what they offer to society and animals. Okay, Maddie, I'll allow you to move into that.
Okay, so moving into what we would call the divine feminine, the sacred feminine. A great example of this in Egyptian society is seen with the sky goddess Nut. On the right, you can see this kind of triangular, sacred triangular figure that we were talking about previously. But Nut basically was the sky goddess. Her husband Geb was the earth god, and together each day they procreated. The sun god, seen in the middle, Re, and then that would be the sun rising, and then the sun setting would be her eating her son, which seems violent, but it's really a beautiful celebration of femininity, fertility, creation, motherly love. And that is something that's quite unique in Egyptian society, is the celebration of divine femininity. Her arched body can almost be, in a modern sense, interpreted as the atmosphere in which she hugs creation and she really nurtures fertility and life. And this honor of the divine feminine really was displayed in veneration of animals in ancient Egypt. Many of the gods were depicted as animals, and as Jennifer previously stated, Egyptians didn't see a difference between animals and humans. They all shared the same soul. And for example, cats were held to a very special regard. On the right is an image of the goddess Basset, who was actually depicted as a cat mostly. To kill a cat was punishable by death. They believed that at your time of dying, as seen on the bottom left figure, that's the that's from the Book of the Dead, your heart would be weighed against a feather, and the gods depicted as animals would judge you in the afterlife on how you treated life and how you honored sacred life. And that would determine your position in the afterlife. So they had a very different relationship that we have in our reality with animals. It was one of honor and it was one of respect. And then moving on to the Holy Trinity, often we view the Holy Trinity as something that's very patriarchal. You have the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and Mary is kind of objectified and left out of the conversation. But we're saying here is there is a divine feminine within Judeo-Christianity that is often ignored. And it is one of, like the goddess Nut, it's one of creation, it's one of veneration for life. And the picture on the left is just another example of sacred triangles, but instead of God at the center, it is Mary as the Divine Mother. And we can see in a lot of Judeo-Christian artwork, Mary is celebrated with animals and with creation. And a very good example of this is the nativity scene. We could argue that the animals are not emancipated in the nativity scene. They are animals of agriculture and of use. But there is something really powerful that we, as a Judeo-Christian reality, forget to acknowledge, is that when Mary was facing persecution, when she was giving birth to her son and she was vulnerable, she really embraced nature. And being surrounded by the animals at a time that's so vulnerable and scary is something that we often don't appreciate.
Just to let you know, that's about 5 minutes to go.
Thank you.
So yeah, this is our last slide. And what we're trying to bring in, like the key takeaway is that we don't just have to use Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. That societies have run in different parts of the world for eras, centuries, and they have understood their relationship with non-human animals as sometimes not even separate, as in the Egyptian reign, as a place to give birth to in Judeo-Christianity, which is common among the ancient world, which is common in the indigenous cosmology and the traditional ecological knowledge we still see today in different remote parts of our globe. And we're saying, can we move to some of these wisdoms and bring them in to allow the emancipation and the freedom call we are doing as scholars for the non-human animal. And as part of that reality, we're really highlighting the sacred feminine, and not in a gender scholarship way as they've been highlighted before, women, or not even in a feminist way, which is more about women's rights. We're saying in a heart way, as a feminine archetype. Aristotle told us back in the Greek era that it was mind over heart. And we are saying, bring the heart back in, bring love, feelings, and the heart back into academia. And we can do this with the divine feminines that have been venerated as sacred for centuries through different cultures and still are today in some spaces, because they will help us bring to fruition the emancipation of the non-human animal. And there's always more, but I'll leave it there. Thank you for allowing us to share, and we look forward to your comments.
Great, that was fascinating. Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer and Madeleine. So we'll move on now to Katja Guenther. I hope I'm saying that right. So Katja's paper is The Future of Feminist Sociology is Animal. Katja is Associate Professor of Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of California, Riverside, USA. She's the author of The Lives and Deaths of Shelter Animals and Making Their Place, Feminism After Socialism in Eastern Germany. So thank you, Katja.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me. I just want to confirm everything is working in the technological sphere here. You can see my one PowerPoint slide, I hope.
Yes, it's
I'm not an intensive PowerPoint user, so I hope I'm not violating conference norms too much in that, but there it is. Thank you so much for that talk, Jennifer and Madeleine. I think we actually have some interesting overlaps between our two presentations, even if we're coming at things from somewhat different angles. I'm coming to you today as a feminist sociologist and as a feminist animal studies scholar who is eager specifically to invite more feminist sociologists into feminist and critical animal studies. I think it's an open secret, and Jennifer just acknowledged this a little while ago, that even as disciplines across the humanities and social sciences embraced many aspects of the so-called animal turn starting in the 2000s, US-based sociology as a field has remained quite stubbornly resistant to thinking about and conducting research involving non-human animals. But feminist sociology especially needs animal studies. And my goal is to invite feminist sociologists to integrate other than human animals into our thinking and analyses. There are a couple of reasons why I'm focusing on inviting feminist sociologists in particular, rather than all sociologists. For starters, feminist sociology is centrally concerned with issues of conflict, inequality, and emancipation, with an investment especially in eradicating gender inequalities, but also other types of inequalities. Feminist and critical animal studies simply aligns with these political and scholarly goals of feminist sociology. Second, the origins of animal studies in ecofeminism create a historical and contemporary alignment between feminist sociology and feminist animal studies. Third, feminist sociologists would be wonderful champions of animal studies in sociology. Over the last many decades, they've contributed to substantial changes in the discipline already. They appreciate new approaches and tirelessly work to make inroads within the discipline as a whole. So my remarks here today are really some of my thoughts as I work to think about strategies for calling in feminist sociologists to animal studies. In our time together here, I want to briefly talk about how feminist animal studies engages with issues that are core to feminist sociology, including the centering of intersectional feminism. I want to present briefly an ethical call grounded in the tradition of feminist ethics and ecofeminism to attend to species in feminist sociology. And time permitting, I also hope to share a few of my own experiences as a feminist sociologist whose scholarship is situated squarely in the field of feminist animal studies. But before I get to all that, I want to start by first acknowledging some of the reasons I think feminist sociologists to date have been reticent to engage with animal studies, because I think it's important to think through obstacles in order to also think about how we can overcome them. Fiona Probyn-Rapsey and Susan Freeman both have identified and critiqued what they call the pussy panic of animal studies. And I think that feminist sociology, in spite of its feminist orientation, is actually part of this panic, precisely because feminists in virtually all fields and areas are especially vulnerable to the issues that the panic highlights. As Probyn-Rapsey discusses, and I'm quoting here, the pussy panic refers to two different but connected concerns. First, it refers to a fear of being seen as doing something ridiculous, like siding with animals in a sentimental way, and in a way that is also associated with women. Second, and I'd add perhaps slightly less relevant for feminist sociology as a deterrent, a pussy panic exists in the field of animal studies itself, evidenced by a masculinist turn that seeks institutional acceptance and credibility by turning away from the early work of women and feminists. Freeman specifically has argued that the field of animal studies only became more legitimate in the academy when its adherents began to point to Derrida as the founding thinker of the area, when in fact many feminist scholars, including Carol Adams, Donna Haraway, Vicki Hearn, and Harriet Ritvo, were the early pioneers of animal studies. This means that the very development of animal studies and the erasure of much of feminists' founding work is a potential site for feminist sociological analysis. Concerns about the legitimacy and the value of feminist animal studies may be a significant deterrent for feminist sociologists. Too often, mainstream masculine academia dismisses feminist work really of any kind. Mainstream academia, as the pussy panic discourse also highlights, tends to characterize animal studies as highly sentimental, sometimes as too political, and or as too feminine in its concerns with animals and the natural world, and therefore as inherently less valuable. And that's an attitude that in and of itself makes the point ecofeminists have been making for decades about the devaluation of women and all that is constructed as more natural or part of nature. These views themselves are rooted in anthroparchy, patriarchy, and colonialism, which also infect some of feminist sociology in its quest to be acknowledged and integrated as a legitimate branch of sociological work. Feminist sociologists may be reasonably afraid that embracing animal studies will contribute to additional or even renewed marginalization, which would be painful for them, especially after the hard-won inroads since the 1970s. I believe a related resistance to integrating the consideration of animals into feminist sociology is concern over how to theorize and talk about animals without seeming to denigrate the concerns of marginalized humans. And this is a response I'm sure everyone here hears from the mainstream as well, that sort of question: with so many problems facing humans, how can we devote our time to caring about animals? And I'm certainly not the first feminist to make the case or argument that we need to move away from a competitive model of thinking about structures of oppression and marginalization to instead appreciate how engaging with what Harlan Weaver calls interspecies intersectionality deepens our knowledge and understanding of complex social structures, and therefore our capacity to change all types of inequalities. I believe feminist sociologists are brave enough to execute just such an analytic and political move. So to that end, let me detail a couple of the particularly vital connections I see between feminist sociology and animal studies. There are powerful scholarly, political, and ethical reasons for feminist sociology to embrace animal studies, especially critical and feminist animal studies. Feminist animal studies examines the experiences of animals as well as human-animal relationships through explicitly feminist lenses. As summarized by feminist animal studies pioneer Greta Gard, and I'm quoting, "When feminists attend to the question of the animal, they do so from a standpoint that centers other animal species, makes connections among diverse forms of oppression, and seeks to put an end to animal suffering. In other words, to benefit the subject of the research." Many of the core areas of concern and inquiry are the same for feminist sociology and for feminist animal studies, including bodily rights and bodily autonomy, violence against feminized and other marginalized or othered bodies, the devaluation of caregiving and reproductive work, state intervention into families and communities, including especially through the welfare state and the carceral state, and local and global ecological crises. By way of one example, which I imagine many here are familiar, animal studies have documented and analyzed the myriad ways in which the practices and ideologies of factory farming are gendered, particularly through heavy reliance on feminized protein and the forced breeding of animals and disruption of their socio-ecological communities. Farmed animals trapped in industrial agriculture lose rights to bodily autonomy, and their capacity both to produce and reproduce is central to their value and commodification. The success of industrial farming rests on the reproductive capacities of animals, and in some species and contexts also on their unpaid caregiving labor. Feminist sociology is inherently interested in these issues and could enrich and expand scholarly and public understanding of animal-involved industries like factory farming, illuminating further how human ideas about gender, including especially the belief that female bodies are inviolable, are imposed onto animals and in turn are reflected back onto humans. Following groundwork laid by scholars like Joan Scott and Douglas Baton, who pioneered the inclusion of gender and disability, respectively, into the existing disciplines of history and beyond, attention to speciesism in sociology illuminates the many intersecting ways in which anthroparchy and speciesism serve directly as systems of oppression of non-human animals, and the many intersecting ways in which anthroparchy and speciesism are used to justify the oppression also of diverse groups of humans. Central to this oppression is the human commitment to maintaining the human-animal divide, which leaves open the possibility, frequently utilized, to claim that some groups of humans, including women, the disabled, and racialized others, are more like animals than they are like humans, or are in some way not fully human and animal-like. The framework of interspecies intersectionality, to date adopted mainly by feminist and queer animal studies scholars, but not so much by feminist sociologists, considers how structures of inequality, such as race, class, gender, disability, and species, are tied up together and are often mutually constitutive. Interspecies intersectionality also illuminates how discourses of animality justify diverse forms of oppression. In the United States, for instance, hundreds of years of systemic violence against Black people, first through the slave system and then through the denial of civil rights, through mass incarceration and police violence, have rested on race, class, and gendered claims that Black people are more animal-like than whites and not truly fully human. Contemporary discourses about criminality in the US, which focus on Black men's deviance and criminality, and more recently, the fear-mongering about Black Lives Matter protests, further engage with century-old ideas about Black people as uncivilized, as unintelligent, as uncultured, as too animal. These claims also have important gendered dimensions. Further, while comparisons between humans and animals, or outright suggestion that a certain group of humans are more animal-like than others, whether implicit or explicit, serve to harm Black people, they also serve to harm animals. That is, animality is used to justify the exploitation of animals themselves, while also being used to justify the exploitation of groups of humans by attributing animality to them. And that latter point is true for numerous groups, including women, whose purported connection to nature has always rendered them suspect. In the contemporary US, assertion of women's animal-like characteristics served to undermine their claims for equal participation. Women's bodily processes, evidence of their so-called naturalness, was fodder especially for recent past US President Donald Trump, who attributed all manner of deficiencies, women's deficiencies to menses. Everyday American English continues to link women, particularly those who step out of line with patriarchal expectations, using terms related to animality, and numerous terms for women's genital area also rely on animal metaphors. Far more than just issues of language, these linguistic practices reflect deeply held social beliefs about women's inferiority due to their animality, with serious consequences for women's life chances. Integrating intersectionality into feminist sociology would draw attention to the ways in which the specter of animality maintains these inequalities, and feminist sociology could bring so much insight into this area. I'd be remiss if I also didn't mention the ethical case for feminist sociology of animals. Feminist sociologists have been particularly committed to an ethical stance of working with and for the most vulnerable, including women who experience multiple marginalizations. It's not a coincidence that in the US, first suffragettes and later radical lesbian feminists were at the forefront of vegetarian and vegan food movements. The ethics of human relationships with animals are clear. Feminists should not exploit animals. Feminist ethics of care integrate attention to and appreciation of emotional reasoning, rather than strictly rational model Enlightenment thinking and contemporary liberal ethical positions. Feminist ethics of care also challenge the dominant social commitment in the US to independence and instead value interdependence and networks of care upon which all people and many animals rely. Feminist sociologists have similarly long stressed the value of care work and the centrality of emotion and in field work and in praxis. As someone who identifies both as a feminist sociologist and a feminist animal studies scholar, I consistently find significant overlap between the ethical positions that scholars in both fields assume. So I think feminist sociologists are already at least halfway there, but need to dedicate more time and energy to examining our internalized speciesism and our participation in anthroparchy. This can be challenging work that often forces us to confront some of our deeply held beliefs and our preferred practices, especially our food ways. Even starting this engagement, though, can help us participate more meaningfully in feminist ethics of care and feminist practices of justice. As ethical issues, it is also relatively easy for feminist sociologists to see how damaging anthropocentrism practices injure huge swaths of humans. Our carceral logics harm both human and other than human animals. Our disregard for the needs and wants of other species and our appetite for animal products helps fuel capitalism's destruction of the planet. To be frank, we won't have a future without greater consideration of the natural world in all areas of scholarship and activism. Climate change.
5-minute note, sorry.
No, not at all, thank you. Climate change, environmental toxicity, and habitat loss are urgent issues that affect human and other than human animals. And we need to find interventions, and feminists can help us in locating these interventions. Further, these are all issues that in and of themselves also reflect the subordination of women and animals. Who is affected? Who makes decisions? Who is excluded from decision making? Who develops or denies the science of climate change and conservation? These things all involve, reflect, and reproduce inequalities of gender and species. With all there is to gain for feminist sociology in embracing consideration of animals, we have to continue to break ground into areas like feminist animal studies, to set aside assumptions and internalized oppressions to help move feminist sociology forward in pursuit of a just and livable world. So my remaining moments, I'll just briefly comment a little bit about how in my own work, I have found engagement with feminist animal studies profoundly liberating. For my most recent book, The Lives and Deaths of Shelter Animals, which explores how inequalities of race, class, gender, disability, and species interact to shape the outcomes for humans and animals who come into contact in a high intake public animal shelter in the Los Angeles area, feminist animal studies has been absolutely critical. Starting from the orientation of feminist animal studies meant that from the outset, I was attuned to interspecies intersectionality, to the gendered dimensions of animal sheltering, volunteering, and rescuing, and to the voices, which we all too often ignore, of animals themselves through engagement with Josephine Donovan's important idea of an animal standpoint. Feminist animal studies provided me with an opportunity to engage with an intersectional lens for understanding and analyzing the social worlds of shelter animals. And such a lens must include species, in addition to the usual trinity in sociology of race, class, and gender, because the meanings and implications of race, class, and gender transcend species boundaries. For example, in my work, I uncovered a discourse around so-called irresponsible owners, or people who shelter volunteers and staff see as lacking the moral fitness to be guardians to companion animals. That discourse relies heavily on dominant social ideas about race, class, and gender, in which shelter staff and volunteers see low-income men of color as particularly problematic guardians and who the shelter routinely makes the scapegoats for problems within the shelter itself. This ultimately allows the shelter to shift responsibility for the shelter's systematic killing of animals in its care onto this alleged problem population of humans it's identified and constructed outside of the shelter. Like other policing agencies, animal control based in the shelter over-polices low-income communities of color, such that animals of poor people of color are more likely to be impounded and ultimately to die in shelters. Poor people of color and their companion animals are at disproportionate risk of having their relationships disrupted by animal control interventions. And these are all dynamics that may not have been readily apparent to me had I not been asking interspecies intersectional questions. Further, my grounding in feminist epistemology and methodology was critical to how I approached conducting a multi-species ethnography. While many animal studies scholars don't study animals, that is, their work centers how humans make sense of, interact with, or use animals without actually looking at the experiences of animals themselves, a feminist approach mandates attention to the animals. Being grounded in a commitment to listening to members of oppressed groups and rooting out oppression was central to my capacity to learn how to witness and attend to animals in my work. This led me to include the perspective of impounded animals in my analysis and writing, and especially to be able to think about shelter animals' resistance to their confinement. Ultimately, I believe that other feminist sociologists will find that thinking about animals will shift their worldviews, research agendas, and routine practices. Of course, not everyone will want to take up research or advocacy projects that focus on animals or human-animal relationships, and I'm not suggesting that they should. What I am suggesting is that feminist sociology stop sidelining the animal completely and begin to bring animality from margin to center, just as it has with women, people of color, poor women, lesbians, and trans and non-binary people. The animal has so much to offer feminist sociology, and feminist sociology would invigorate feminist and critical animal studies. Feminist animal studies is deeply intersectional, committed to multi-species justice and the emancipation of all living beings, grounded in respect for and celebration of interdependence, care work, and bodily autonomy, and affirming of epistemologies and methodologies that center outsider knowledges. I very much hope other feminist sociologists will join me there. Thank you.
Thank you, Katja. That was, yeah, lots of intersections with the first paper as well. So we'll move on now to Richard Twine's paper titled, Where are the Non-Human Animals in the Sociology of Climate Change? So Richard is a senior lecturer in social sciences and co-director of the Centre for Human Animal Studies at Edge Hill University. He's author of Animals as Biotechnology, Ethics, Sustainability and Critical Animal Studies, and co-editor of The Rise of Critical Animal Studies from the Margins to the Centre. He's also the co-founder of the European Association for Critical Animal Studies. So over to Richard.
Thanks, Paula. I hope everybody can see my screen.
Yes, it's clear.
Great. Let me maximize that. Okay, yeah, I hope that I will also have some connections to make with the first two papers as well. So unusually for me, this is a presentation of a paper that's already been published, which is nice. So if you're interested in the content, you can seek out the paper afterwards for more detail. And this was published at the end of last year in Society in Animals. Okay. So a substantial endeavor of critical animal studies, at least in its academic expression, has been to contest traditional academic disciplines for their omission of non-human animals, something that we all know about. And it's led to a process of rethinking ontologies in fields, disciplines, and their subdisciplines as well. And we usually refer to that as the animal turn. And it's at least well known amongst us. I'm not sure how well known it is always amongst people outside of the field. So we can ask, well, why has the animal turn been necessary? Well, we think obviously there's something wrong in the fact of leaving out non-human animals. And we might want to fancifully kind of imagine an alternative history in which knowledge did not emerge in such an anthropocentric manner. Imagine if sociology had developed, for example, with an appreciation that animals also comprised society and of social life as well. Yet knowledge and disciplines did emerge out of interconnected, classed, gendered, racialized, and anthropocentric ways of thinking in the development of capitalism over the last 500 years. And in terms of sort of adding some specificity to anthropocentrism, there's a few people we could go to for a definition of that. Fiona Probyn-Rapsey, for example, has a long chapter about it. But here I'm using Matthew Calarco's definition of anthropocentrism from his recent book about key concepts in animal studies. So he defines anthropocentrism as including a narcissistic focus on human exceptionalism, a binary account of human-animal differences, a strong moral hierarchy that ranks human beings over animals and other non-human beings, a tendency to de- and subhumanize certain populations, and that should include obviously human populations as well, and institutions that aim to protect and give privilege to beings deemed fully human. So there is that kind of structural element to his definition there as well. And the critique of this within the animal turn can be viewed as part of contemporary decolonization attempts, I think, alongside correctives to the classed, gendered, and racialized biases of knowledge production. And obviously, in the last 12 months, there's been a lot, even in the media, about the latter. So in this paper, I don't take on the entire discipline of sociology. I examine the subdiscipline of sociology, the sociology of climate change, as a case study to examine the extent to which it has been inclusive or not inclusive of other animals and human-animal relations. Okay. So the sociology of climate change. It's a relatively recent area of sociology, about 20 years old, although environmental sociology, of which it sometimes could be seen as part of, emerged in the late 1970s, early 80s. And I'd like to make the case that the sociology of climate change is a particularly important subdiscipline for sociology. Climate change knowledge is dominated by the natural sciences. Think about the IPCC, for example. There is no social science version of that. But the social sciences are vital if we are to understand how the climate crisis emerged and how societies can change to avoid it. And, examining other things like the highly political mediation of climate change in our culture, in newspapers, whether newspapers even bother to mention it, for example. And also in thinking about the sociology of scientific knowledge as well, thinking critically about the production of climate change knowledge. However, there is a danger that the usefulness of sociology in contributing to this issue is curtailed if it doesn't get the framing of it right. And sociology has traditionally been anthropocentric, as paper 1 reminded us all about, assuming society and social life to be essentially about what humans do. So in thinking about the sociology of climate change, would it approach climate change and the climate crisis with all that kind of disciplinary baggage, or would it use the moment as a reflexive opportunity to also critique sociology and offer new post-anthropocentric concepts? And here I have a slide asking the question, why should the sociology of climate change be critical of anthropocentrism and inclusive of non-human animals? What sort of things might social scientists of the climate crisis be interested in? Well, I've already hinted at that in a previous slide, but here we can sort of condense that into categorizing around the emergences of, trying to explain the emergences of the climate crisis, the impacts that are already taking place, and possible interventions as well, which we might also express as the history of the climate crisis, the effects of the climate crisis, and what sort of policy might be meaningful in terms of addressing the climate crisis. So my argument is that you cannot approach any of these without including analyses of human-animal relations. And if you think about these in turn, well, we can think about the emergences in terms of arguments of the animal industrial complex, which is a broad term that I've written on previously, which I've used it to refer to much wider than animal agriculture. But in terms of the agricultural element of the animal industrial complex, it's now pretty much accepted that it's a significant contributor to historical and contemporary emissions. And I've recently been doing some other research looking at the emissions debate around animal agriculture. If you want to know more about that, then get in touch or follow my Twitter. I'll be posting more on that in the next few weeks. Impacts, the effects on other species of the climate crisis are already deep and broad. At the moment, I'm writing a book for Sydney University Press on the climate crisis. And in that, I've got a chapter detailing all the sort of natural science research, looking at all the impacts that have already happened in terms of how climate change is affecting other species. And also impacts on other animals are also generative of new human-animal relations themselves. For example, climate change is impacting and will increasingly impact agriculture. It's also impacting insects, and it would be a mistake to forget about insects, as sometimes we do within critical animal studies, that the impact on insects is obviously really, there's a lot of research into the way in which insect numbers are being threatened, and they also kind of thinking more human-centeredly that then can lead to changing patterns of human health and illness as well. Thirdly, interventions. There's now a substantial body of scientific literature arguing that dietary change toward plant-based diets is an important intervention for addressing the climate crisis. And I've been documenting the kind of high-level reports and peer-reviewed articles the last 15 years, which argue that it's an important intervention for the climate crisis and overlapping crises as well around biodiversity, the sixth mass extinction, and laterally thinking about addressing pandemics and, for example, water pollution as well. So, in light of all of this, one might reasonably expect a sociology of climate change to acknowledge all of this and to research it further. It should really be at the heart, I think, of what the sociology of climate change is doing. Not the only thing, of course. Sociology of climate change is also obviously going to be interested in our transport behavior, our mobilities, our energy-related behavior as well. Okay. So in terms of looking at this subfield, what did I do methodologically? How did I approach it? And how did I sort of make the assessment of whether or not it was being inclusive of non-human animals? So the aim really was to look for evidence of coverage and analysis of human-animal relations in the emergences, impacts, and potential interventions related to climate change. And in thinking about my method, well, what would be the best way to review the subfield, the sociology of climate change field effectively? Well, I basically did a review really of key texts and also the key journal article literature as well. So I looked at key sociology of climate change texts and I sampled the journal literature. 12 key texts were chosen. I checked the robustness of my sample by talking to other academics in the sociology of climate change field. And then I wanted to do more than that. Obviously, I wanted to look at the journal articles. I compiled a list of what I thought, and I did this without obviously, choosing articles which I somehow knew didn't talk about animals. So I was careful on that score. So I chose a database of 24 key sociology of climate change journal articles. Then I wanted to go a little bit further to make it even more robust. I compiled a second database of journal articles, which consisted of all the articles published by the journal Environmental Sociology, a journal which was formed in 2015, which were concerned with climate change. Excuse me. And this second journal article database amounted to 38 articles. So that makes a total sample consisting of 12 books and 62 journal articles. Some of the books there are featured on the right hand of that slide. And here briefly are the journal articles. So this table 1 shows the first sample. Let me just, that's the sample of books. That's the 12 books. You'll recognize them. Those of you familiar with sociology will recognize some of the names here. Some quite famous names in sociology have written about climate change. Anthony Giddens, John Urry, Bruno Latour down the bottom here. And then this slide here shows the first journal article database. And it's worth, in all cases, it's worth looking at the date range on these tables. So that the book sample was from 2009 to 2017. The first journal article sample was from 1996 to 2018. And again, you can sort of see, if you know the field, you'll recognize some of these authors' names: York, Richard York, Steve Yearley, John Urry again, Ulrich Beck, very famous sociologist, Elizabeth Shove, and John Bellamy Foster, who is associated with eco-socialism, for example, Carrie Norgard as well. And in the second journal article database from the journal Environmental Sociology, so long it's on 2 slides, these are lesser known, I would say lesser known authors, but I think it was really good to go into that, that journal, which is specializing in environmental sociology and focusing on the papers within that journal that have looked at climate change in particular. So the date range for this one, as I said, the journal was formed in 2015, so it's a much more recent sample. It goes from 2015 to 2019, and you can see the range of topics there as well. Okay, so what were my results? So only 2 texts, of the 12 texts, only 2 had any serious inclusion of human-animal relations. These were by Matthew Adams, I think it is, and Julie Doyle. So Adams reflects upon the issue of valuing the more than human, as well as devoting some discussion to birds within climate change and challenging taken for granted human-animal relations. So Adams kind of gets a tick mark in terms of inclusion. Doyle focuses on the mediation of climate change. She's associated with the sociology of media, and devotes an entire chapter to the topic of meat and dairy consumption. So I think I've since found out that these two authors are quite sympathetic with critical animal studies. So I think it's perhaps unsurprising that these were the 2 out of the 12 which kind of had pass marks. The remaining 10 books, which included some very substantial edited volumes, in some cases, this meant that they had 30, 40 chapters by different authors, are far sparser in their inclusion of non-human animals. And they had basically just a few cursory mentions of issues related to human-animal relations. There's far more detail, by the way, on the results in the extended paper. Now, what about the journal article samples? Sample 1, 24 articles. Sample 2, the 38 articles from environmental sociology. Well, I'm not going to read all of this out, but I'm going to read the parts in bold. So for the first sample, none of the 24 articles included a significant consideration of non-human animals or human-animal relations in the emergences, impacts, or mitigations of climate change, mitigations/interventions. And so that was quite a stark finding. A couple of little tiny exceptions. Again, you can refer to the more detailed results in the paper. The second sample, 38 articles, only one of these articles, 2.6% of the sample, or 0.7% of the whole journal's output, environmental sociology in its first 5 years, contained any significant framings or sections considering how human-animal relations figure in the emergences, impacts, or mitigations of climate change. Okay. So what sort of conclusions can be drawn from this? Lack of engagement, this paucity of coverage. The survey of the sociology of climate change subdiscipline revealed a consistent level of exclusion of non-human animals and human-animal relations. The fact of the presence of human-animal relations in the broader climate science literature pertaining to the emergences, impacts, and possible interventions that could be directed against climate change seems to have made little impact upon the sociology of climate change to date. The sociology of climate change seems to have assumed and retained the anthropocentrism of sociology rather than worked to contest it. And these findings are arguably surprising because the first high-profile report clarifying the role of animal agriculture in the emergences of climate change, Steinfeld et al. 2006, better known as Livestock's Long Shadow, predates most of the literature sampled here, and also because environmental sociology, of which we can view that as a kind of parent of the sociology of climate change, emerged at the same time as the sociological interest in non-human animals back in the late 70s, early 80s. So I think it's fair to say that the sociology of climate change has had plenty of time to be aware of the animal turn critique of sociology, and yet still we have this situation of exclusion.
That's the 5-minute mark, Richard.
Perfect. Thanks, Paula. So were it to take on board the criticisms made here, the sociology of climate change would have to become more overtly critical of the role of the animal industrial complex in the climate crisis. So, I mean, you could argue that it's kind of protectionist. It's protecting itself from not doing that by excluding the topic. I offer one or two other explanations for the exclusion in the paper. For example, the sample showed that the sociology of climate change is quite a male-dominated field, and going on arguments from elsewhere in critical animal studies that men tend to be less sympathetic to criticizing the consumption of animals, for example, then that might be a potential explanation for why the topic is being largely excluded. So yeah, instead, much of the work of the sociology of climate change is focused on transport systems and energy-related practices and infrastructure, less so on food practices, but there is some, but whether that extends into then thinking about human-animal relations is another matter. So sociology and the sociology of climate change is thus arguably selling itself short in terms of its contribution to the debate on climate change. Anthropocentrism, I would say, is holding it back from making a more systemic critique, which actually would be in affinity with sociology's traditional strengths of deconstructing social norms and envisioning alternative societies. So it could actually be stronger. It could be more faithful to the science that is out there. But as it stands at the moment, it's a field that is oddly ignoring human-animal relations and is curtailing its own potential for radicality, I would say. So there you go. That's a kind of introduction and coverage and summary of the paper. And if you'd like a PDF of the paper, of the article, then simply drop me an email and I'll send that off to you. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll welcome any comments or questions. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Richard, and thanks all the other speakers. So we'll now open it up to general questions. And I noticed here we have one comment from Christina. Is it just a comment, Christina? I can read it out and see if Jennifer would like, or Madeleine would like to respond. I'll maybe start off with that and get the conversation going. So Christina just commented that she thinks in Orthodox Christian dogma, the Holy Trinity is the three faces of God, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, rather than the, Mary is just sidelined as just the Mother of God. And I know that in Jennifer and Madeleine's presentation, they said that that Mary did feature quite centrally in some depictions. But do you want to comment on that comment?
Maddie, why don't you start if you have an offering?
Yeah, well, the Holy Trinity is God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, and that's how it's celebrated in Christian religion. We're just offering a different perspective of Mary as a kind of divine mother, celebrating her creation and celebrating her role in the Judeo-Christian reality. Yeah, just to celebrate femininity a little bit more within a very patriarchal religion that already exists.
Thank you, Maddie. Yeah, and I'll just expand a bit to say that there's a real support around Jesus and heart space with Mary Magdalene and Divine Mother Mary. And there's also like an amorphous around Holy Spirit and different interpretations. So, I'm just moving into this with my work and to understanding all of these different cultures, religions, and realities. And I feel like what I've known for the past 30 years of being in this thinking space and this heart space is that we interpret the words the way our realities have been constructed to us and our lived experiences play out. And so I feel like so many of us, especially in modernity, have such limited beliefs that we can move into these other knowings and wisdoms with an open heart and open mind and say, what can you offer? Because we are at a brink with animals and with the world, and we need to expand our horizons. And I am testing the boundaries of academia by saying, let's move not into religion, let's move into the spirituality, let's move into the soul space, because that's the uniting force with animals and humans in indigenous cosmology, traditional ecological knowledge, ancient wisdoms throughout our globe. So yeah, thank you for the comment. It's good to see all these perspectives, whether it's orthodox, unorthodox, like the dogma, the convention, and kind of just to like interweave those realities to see what they offer us and what lives behind the language. I have this quote from Rumi, I was going to say, who's a Persian poet and a Sufi mystic, and he's from the 13th century, but he says, quote, "When soul sweetens and thrives more than with language, heart has plundered mind of its eloquence," unquote. So there's this understanding that words, and we like to put privilege around words in modernity, but what about the imagery? What about the offerings behind the words, what I call in my research and work sentience? What more is unveiled behind the language? And that's what we have to explore. That's the richness. And that involves the soul and something more than we see in our very material reality. So thank you. I'll stop there.
Very interesting. We have a question here from Ed May. Ed May, would you like to read it out, or will I? Feel free to switch on your microphone if you want to read it out yourself. Or I will.
Yes.
Okay, yep, great.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'd be happy to. This was a question for Richard Twine. I was curious to know if you think that the result, what you observed, and it was a very, very interesting analysis that you did, this marginality of non-human animals in the literature, might it be linked to the fact that you kind of selected the main publications? And given the fact that animal studies are still marginal in the social sciences in general, might you have a very different picture if you expanded the scope of your sample? Of course, you can't obviously analyze the whole literature, it's too large, but since you have probably looked at so many articles that maybe you didn't include in your sample, I was wondering if this was also a matter of, you know, this topic being more at the margins in less important publications.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, no, not really, because I didn't just look at the main publications because and the main people. I was kind of careful not to just look at the kind of well-known big names, and especially in terms of expanding the sample into the environmental sociology journal. You know, these were non-big names, if you like, and this was just, you know, I guess we might say rank and file social science researchers looking at the issue of climate change. And again, the situation of exclusion was repeated within the body of the publication of the journal Environmental Sociology. So I don't think so. Of course, there is a broader literature which is all, for example, I could extend it massively, for example, into literature on transitions and the sociology of consumption and so on. But I was carefully kind of looking at the sociology of climate change. I was trying to kind of demarcate that subfield. So if I'd looked at, maybe I could have looked at more of, you know, practice theory and transition research, but I also know that field pretty well myself, and a lot of it does overlap with the sociology of climate change. And well, I think I was like the first person to apply practice theory to veganism, for example. And there are, since I published this paper, there have been there's been an interesting paper that has by Madeleine et al., which has used the multi-level perspective, which is a social science framework, but not the sociology of climate change, to look at plant-based milks as a niche, kind of struggling to kind of find a position against the kind of dominant dairy milk regime. So there is research happening. And then there are some of the authors mentioned by the first paper, actually, Ryan Gunderson would be a good example, where I would classify him as somebody who has kind of looks at the sociology of climate change and does include animals. But I would say he's already kind of knowledgeable. He's already kind of part of critical animal studies as well. So the sort of only people that are kind of looking at kind of including human-animal relations within the sociology of climate change are those who have, such as myself and people like Ryan, who have kind of never sort of seen that separation and have always sort of you know, had that kind of ontological difference where animals are not excluded from that subfield of sociology.
Are there any other questions? Anybody? Oh, there, Maria. Sorry, didn't see you. Maria, would you like to?
Yes, thank you. So actually, thanks everyone for the presentations. They were really interesting and really great. So my question, sorry, I'm tired. My question starts from Jennifer and Madeleine's presentation, but it's actually open to all of the speakers, and I'm interested in everyone's thoughts on it. So it's a question of sorts, because I find it not easy at all to conceptualize what is feminine. So my question is maybe like how can maybe masculinities that are not understood in a patriarchal way and other forms of gender expressions or gender practices that are neither feminine nor masculine, what can they bring to animal liberation and to also human liberation and collective liberation, especially because I understand feminism as not only having to do with the feminine, and because these issues are so connected in so many ways. Thank you.
I can go first. Maria, it's so good to see you in a different setting. Thank you for this fascinating question. And I'm still trying to put this in language. It's like somewhere else. So for me, I also read a lot of literature from the East, and that's non-academic, from Buddhism and Hinduism and Sufism. And so, I'm coming at this with more than just academic scholarship. I'm coming at this with a frame of what are wisdoms, and there's not a privilege around. And so that they're a lot of times based and founded in different other kinds of religious institutions. And my work has really moved into traditional ecological knowledge and that subfield. So for me, the feminine archetype, in Buddhism and Hinduism, Jainism, there's like a feminine and masculine to all humans. That's what they call an energy or chi or prana, depending on Chinese or Sanskrit language. And so when we say feminine archetype, that says heart space, feelings, emotion, love, and all of that, which Aristotle led us away from in the Greek era, right? Because we wanted to center more on the mind and that bring that into our institutional framing. And so the thing is somehow the masculine archetype, which is naturally pure as is the feminine archetype, was corrupted. So it's not men who are corrupted, it's the archetype that has been brought in. And I would argue that feminism and women, through the movements, the first, second, third wave of feminism, have had to make changes within the corrupt system, within the hegemonic patriarchal system that's corrupt. So they've had to a bit embrace that masculine corruptness. And so there's a bit of like completely detaching from emotion. And, I really embrace like Laurel Richardson from Sociology, her work, which is qualitative, Ruth Baer, Norman Geets. There's a lot of men too that embrace this emotion, and it's usually an ethnographic work because it's lived experience. And if we're going to study another human, they were studying humans more so, or another species I'll bring in, then we need to not objectify them. We need to be in it. We are not just the observer. We are participants, participant observation. Our social reality merges with theirs, and then there's this interweaving of knowings. And we can't be objective completely about that. And so there is this subjectivity that needs to I think, unveil in our discourse. And so this is like big. It's bigger than this paper. It's bigger than this conversation, but it's a move along that path. And I see an opening and an expansion. And so thinking about, I'll just say this, because I know that Katja and Richard, of course, want to respond as well, is that there's also then, after the feminine archetype, for me in my work, and Maddie, there's the sacred feminine, which is different systems of reality, which have placed women not in a matriarchal way, because that has corrupt energy around it, but in a way that is a veneration for their empowerment to create, recreate, have fertility, and that was seen as a natural process and not detached from animals. So I'm saying, can we move into those realities to see when women too had not just equality, but veneration, which is expanding beyond equality. And so there's just a lot to reveal. And I, I'm excited to hear what my colleagues have to say, because this is all so new to us. Is literally, it's like, tomorrow, how can we emancipate animals? That's what's happening. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Maria.
Any other comments there?
I thought Richard's microphone was off, so I wasn't sure if that meant that he wanted to say something next.
No,
but I'm happy
just
to.
pure laziness. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Always looking for the mysterious Zoom indicators. I think I'll just add briefly to respond to your question that I think one of the big contributions specifically of feminist scholarship in animal studies has been exactly attention to how patriarchy and violence against animals and violence against women, are hinged together. And so one of the significant insights from feminist animal studies really looks at the practices and beliefs in Western patriarchal societies specifically, and how much food ways and men's endorsed relationships with animals, rest on patriarchal logic. Marty Keel, has written, I think it was probably 15, 20 years ago already, an essay called Toppling Patriarchy with a Fork, in which she lays out a strategy for using veganism and vegetarianism as a way to undermine the power and authority of patriarchy. And I think what we're also seeing more recently is a great deal more incorporation specifically of indigenous knowledge based in the Americas, to start thinking about alternate models of masculinity and also non-binary genders, to problematize and denaturalize the idea that men somehow have an inherent or innate desire to hunt and to kill and to slaughter other beings, because we know from other cultures that that's not a cultural universal, either as a gender practice or as a practice at all. And if we can look into other times and other places, and even into contemporary times and places, we can see very much evidence for that and alternate ways of building relationships with creaturely kin, right, or the animals who we share our life worlds with and who we don't necessarily need to engage in violence against to try to demonstrate our participation in dominant modes of masculinity.
Okay, thanks, Katja. Well, we have 10 minutes left, and we've got 2 questions on the chat room just now, so I'll hopefully get through both of them. Chin, would you like me to read out the question, or would you like to switch on your mic and read it yourself? I'm happy to read it out. I'll just go ahead. Okay, so Chin says, a question to Richard, perhaps a, there we go. Yes, okay. Question to Richard, he says, perhaps a very blunt one. Can we ever expect non-human animals to receive more attention in climate, environment, and environmental sociology if the majority of the scholars themselves are meat eaters or take a reformist stance on animal agriculture, for example, ecological modernization?
Thank you. Thanks for that question. I like it a lot. I like blunt questions, are great. It's interesting, isn't it? If we think about environmental sociology and maybe the way in which environment has been operationalized in other disciplines, environmental philosophy and environmental politics, maybe we could mention a few other disciplines too. They always tend to be operationalized with some kind of magical exclusion of non-human animals. And I think, obviously, I think there's some truth to your point about, well, if people are engaging in the practices of animal consumption, then they're not likely to to want to cover areas which challenge that. But of course, I guess that's, this fall into critical animal studies to kind of interrogate such views and to try to kind of, interrogate environmental sociology and allied disciplines, which magically construct this notion of environment with an environment absent of non-human animals. It's a very bizarre conception of environment and ecology that somehow exists without non-human animals. Is this just an environment of what? Of trees? It's poor work, and obviously we could directly want to contest their practices, but I think we can contest their ontologies as well, and that should bring non-human animals onto their agenda, just on the grounds of them doing poor social science. Paula, your mic is off.
Sorry, does anybody else want to comment on that question?
Yeah, I just had to laugh, Richard, because this comment, which has sarcasm all over it, of what is an environment of trees? And I just maybe was the only one laughing, but I've thought about this for years, right? And so thank you for your work. It's so valuable. And I could say a lot, but I'll just say that York and Bessick, I believe, just put out a piece on biodiversity loss, and we should have a sociology of biodiversity. And basically they said it's not measured biodiversity, which can be critiqued in and of itself, the concept, because it's too complicated. That's the takeaway. It's too complicated to measure, and all these different layers of complication. So it's let's just measure something easy, and let's just take water by itself, or air pollution by itself. And so I guess I'm inviting us all to let's just be complicated, because that's what's happening. Is we tried to simplify it and it just didn't work. So let's make it a web, like a spider as it is, and just try to navigate our way through. So anyway, that's just my little piece of wisdom. And yeah, I just again wanted to thank you for your good work, Richard, around this topic. And Katja, your work was amazing too. Just this push for let's just move feminism right into animals together. And it's kind of the same, right? Because it's where are the animals? We could every discipline we could go in, it's where are the animals? It's the same, it's the theme. It's where are the animals? And there's an intention to the style that I just said that 3 times. It's a call. So anyway, I'll stop there, because of course, as a professor, we can just go on. And so.
Okay, if there's no other comments, or from Katja or anybody, I'll move on to the final question then maybe, and it's a good follow-up to just what Jennifer was saying. So Darren asks, in what ways have the growing amount of interdisciplinary work helped or hindered the push to take human-animal relations and animals themselves more seriously in sociology? I'm thinking in some ways an animal turn in every discipline might force people to take notice, yet different theories and views on human-animal relations, for example, versions of post-humanism and new materialism that reconcile with or are not particularly critical of animal exploitations, are perhaps further excluding CAS in some ways. And that's open to any of the panelists.
I think that's a great question. And jumping back to Jennifer's idea of needing to think about this as a complicated web, this is perhaps another area where we see that. I think one of the struggles animal studies has faced is whether to try to seek integration into a whole bunch of different and often seemingly unrelated academic disciplines, from English and history to linguistics to sociology and geography and anthropology. Or whether to try to establish itself as sort of its own independent program. At least in the United States to date, there are very, very few programs, academic programs that actually offer degrees, even certificates specifically in animal studies. So generally those scholars are housed in other programs. But I think, you know, for me anyway, I find my peer group, you know, as much through my broad disciplinary home, which is gender and sexuality studies, as through animal studies organizations. But I don't think interdisciplinary work inherently has to result in or contribute to marginalization within any particular discipline, because that beginning kind of helps us develop a critical mass of scholars in various other areas who can really support one another and build up strength within any one discipline. That being said, I think, you know, animal studies also, we're talking today about sociology, but I think other fields are doing a much better job. Anthropology specifically comes to mind as the discipline in which there's the highest concentration in the social sciences of people who are really thinking about and engaging with animals, including around issues of climate change and extinction. And maybe secondarily geography as well, and critical geography, that we're seeing a lot of that. Sociology has just been, at least in the United States, in my experience, really, really slow to catch up. And I think we just have some founding frameworks that don't make us as amenable to animal perspectives and work centered on human-animal relationships as perhaps anthropology and geography do. But hopefully over time, we'll keep continuing to see more progress in this direction as people recognize as well the crisis that we're in.
Should I quickly answer that as well? Thank you, Darren, and thank you for getting up. I know how early you got up, and it's scary. So I think it's a good question, and yeah, these sort of interdisciplinary kind of developments and ideas, yeah, I think there's probably an argument to be made there that maybe they don't help, because almost they become little islands of escape for those who are interested in maybe the theoretical aspects of human-animal relations, but don't necessarily want to pursue the political dimensions and the practical dimensions of currently dominant human-animal relations. In other words, the kind of, you know, the level of violence and slaughter that we currently have. And, you know, the same might be said of environmental humanities as well. You get human animals work in there, but it's almost depoliticized on the question of the animal. So I think, yeah, there are definitely questions to explore there about how those ideas become popular and taken on, because they have a certain safety to them, perhaps. I wrote a paper on posthumanism, 11 years ago or something, and I kind of looked at all the different sort of discourses of posthumanism and critical posthumanism, transhumanism, and so on. And I was sort of looking at them to which of these were actually taking a critical perspective on anthropocentrism. And, you know, I was sort of struggling to find kind of recent ideas at that time of posthumanism which were doing that. Of course, some critical animal studies scholars have used posthumanism, and I have as well. But I think it has become a sort of a little bit of a refuge for intellectual interest, which doesn't want to kind of take the political critique too far. That would be my, maybe that would be controversial to some people, but that's potentially my take on it.
Well, that's delve into disciplines and pedagogy is a great transition for the panel that we have tonight from 8 till 10 p.m. If people can join, we'll have Dinesh Bodiwell, Helena Pedersen, and Vasily Stanescu. So I'd encourage everybody to come to that, to carry on this sort of discussion. And if you would like to, please go to the main room after this. Don't just leave the conference, because we have another poetry reading from Gordon Mead, and some final words on the day, probably from Claire and Richard. Yeah. So if I missed anything, no. So if everybody would like to leave the room and head back to the main room, yeah, I think that's been a really an interesting session. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Paula.
Thank you.